BBC Radio 5 Live.
Your call now. Should Britain pull out of the European Court of Human Rights? Carry on Qatada, Europe's court jesters. Many headlines this morning focus on Abu Qatada. Do we need this court? We're a civilised country, good human rights record. Would we be any worse off without it? There are those who say we should part ways with it. It's just holding us back, coming up with some outrageous decisions. But it's good to be at the forefront of this in the world, to show a good example to the rest of the world. Is one of our finest achievements, protecting the millions of people, the human beings through these rights of war, safeguarding their rights, our rights. It's having to keep people like Abu Qatada a price worth paying for the greater good. Justice Secretary Ken Clarke says you can't judge its success on a few high-profile failures.
A minister like myself can't keep up a running commentary on every decision of every court, reacting to newspaper descriptions of the facts or the reaction of aggrieved relatives or victims or whoever. This dotting about from case to case where it happens to have annoyed or upset somebody is no way of judging legal process.
Is he right? Should we look at the big picture and be thankful for it? Should we pull out of the European Court of Human Rights? That's the question. 0500 909 693, that's the number, and here's the text, 85058. Good morning. Right, the European Court of Human Rights is a big conference about it in Brighton, seeing if it can be sorted out in the sense that there is such a backlog of cases. Can they get them through the system quicker? So people who very much support the European Court of Human Rights worry that that will sideline justice for some people. It's 6 minutes past 9 o'clock. Spoke earlier on to Ken Clarke, the Secretary of State for Justice, on this. Mentioned Paul Houston. Good morning, Paul.
Good morning, Nicky.
Good to talk to you. Now, I mentioned to him that I had spoken to you about this. Just to tell people, just joining us, yours is one of the cases that people always cite as an egregious example of it not working and a perverse decision. Amy, right, your daughter, 12 years old, knocked down and killed by a failed Iraqi asylum seeker, Mr. Ibrahim. The courts tried to deport him. He was allowed to stay after arguing it would breach his human rights. Specifically, this was Article 8, wasn't it?
That's right, yes.
Would you tell us about your campaign.
Well, my campaign is about making the Human Rights Act sort of balanced and fair for the individual. My argument's always been the court doesn't take into consideration my human rights over Mr. Ibrahim's, and at no point was my viewpoint took into consideration in the tribunal.
What did the judge say to you at the tribunal?
Well, the UK Border Agency actually, the barrister for the UK Border Agency actually said, when I asked him what about my rights, he said, well, quite frankly, Mr. Houston, you haven't got any. However, you know, when it went to the High Court, the Royal Court of Justice, the High Court judge there did say, even though he wasn't actually ruling on the original decision, he said, had this case come before him, he possibly would have took a different viewpoint, which makes me sort of feel that I was sort of right in what I was saying, but the decision had already been made, so they didn't really want to be seen to be looking stupid and overruling another judge. And
how do you feel about the fact Mr. Ibrahim has been allowed to stay here after everything that has happened? And he drove away from the scene and he didn't have insurance, he didn't have a licence, did he? How do you feel about the fact that he was granted leave to stay here because of his right to a family life, given that you lost Amy? Well,
it's very galling, and you know, I mean, I'm not an unreasonable man. You know, had he just come into the country and he wasn't aware of the driving regulations, and he got in a car and drove it, and it had been an accident, and he was genuinely remorseful for what he'd done, if he'd stayed with the car with Amy, then it could have made all the difference.
He left the scene, yeah.
But he ran off and left her trapped under the wheels of the car, and she died. She died 4 hours later. I had the difficult decision, well, the awful decision that any parent would have to go through, which is having to switch a life support machine off. But, excuse me, but it was the fact that he got in a car and drove it a year later, and he had a string of other convictions for possession of drugs and damage to property and harassment, burglary, and he'd also been, the family man that he claimed to be, he was also arrested for a domestic incident and bound over to keep the peace, you know. So, you know, it's very galling when somebody claims to be a family man, and in reality, you know, the fact is quite different. And it's the way that the tribunals are set up, where they accept hearsay evidence.
We'll get on to that. Can I play you this interview? You possibly didn't hear it because I mentioned your case because I met you the other day at the Big Questions, and it was a great meeting you.
Thank you.
And talking to you at length about this on the air and off the air. And so because of that, fresh in my mind, I mentioned this as an example to Ken Clarke. I had an exchange with the Justice Secretary earlier on. You can probably hear it now for the first time. Here's some of what happened here. 12-year-old Amy Houston, she was run over by an Iraqi failed asylum seeker who was in Britain. He fled the scene. She died in hospital. And this is key, and you will be able to comment on this. He was sentenced... No, you will be able to comment on this, because I'm going to ask you...
You're relying on newspaper accounts.
I'm not. I spoke to her father the other day. I spoke to her father the other day.
But you're still relying on newspaper accounts.
I'm relying on her father.
Yeah, with the European Court of Human Rights also said that the holding of DNA from people who've not been charged... Of course it is.
Can I ask you about Article 8?
We only lose 1 in 1,000.
Can I ask you about Article 8?
1 in 100.
This Iraqi asylum seeker was...
Can we deal with what we're doing?
Can I ask you about Article 8? Yes. Can I ask you about Article 8? Yes.
Article 8 of what?
The right to a family life. This Iraqi asylum seeker was allowed to stay in this country, and he was a failed asylum seeker because of Article 8, because he had a right to a family life. What Paul, Amy's father, says is, what about his right to a family life? Now he's lost his only daughter.
Well, it sounds like a tragic case, but really it is completely silly to reduce such a tragedy for the family and everybody else to this absurd exchange. A minister like myself can't keep up a running commentary on every decision of every court, reacting to newspaper descriptions of the facts or the reaction of aggrieved relatives or victims or whoever.
So Paul, what do you think?
I think the fact that he never answered the question sort of speaks volumes there. He knows there's a problem with Article 8, and clearly the conference this week isn't going to address that problem. This is the whole point. This is how politicians dance around the subject and they talk a lot of hot air, but to actually get any tangible sort of real decisions to be made, it just doesn't seem to happen. And I'm a bit disappointed, really. I would have liked to listen to what Mr. Ken Clarke had to say, because he's fully aware of my case. They all are. And the fact that he never answered the question sort of speaks volumes. It sort of says that I'm right.
Well, Roger Helmer as well there, and Isabella Sankey from Liberty. Hello, Isabella.
Hi there.
Good morning. Roger Helmer, Conservative MEP, defected to the UK Independence Party. Helmer, do we need to get out of this legislation?
We absolutely do. The whole series of examples of just outrageous and perverse decisions, and the public out there are angry about it. I'm just astonished to hear Ken Clarke saying, in effect, look, don't trouble me with the facts. I'm a minister. I can't be bothered with the facts. I can't be bothered with public opinion. We're just going to keep doing what we're doing. It's just not good enough.
But he's right. He's right about the positives. He's right about the fact that the DNA database, innocent people's DNA, cannot be kept. He's right about the fact that we're a leading example of a beacon for gay rights in the world. He's right about all the positives. You never talk about the positives, do you?
Well, we in Britain can make the right decisions for our country. What we've done is we have outsourced a whole range of decisions to foreign, well, I wouldn't call them judges. Most of them have very little legal experience. It's a political court, not a court where justice is dispensed. We have a long history and a very proud history of our legal system and our human rights in the UK, and a coach and horses is being driven through that, and a whole series of perverse decisions is coming out.
Well, okay, tell us about another... Isabella, I'll bring you in a second here. I'm sure you're dying to grab this one. Tell us about another perverse decision. Of course they happen, and what happened to Paul and Amy, happened to Amy and Paul, it's absolutely tragic.
Well,
it's
awful.
awful.
Had a whole succession of these issues of family life.
Let's have another one. Give us another one.
Well, I'm sorry, I don't have a list here for you. It is not my job to make a list. It is my job to be aware of the situation, and frankly, you can open the newspaper every day, and you can do that as well as I can. Again and again, we have people... Well, we have Abu Qatada, we have all these people.
Isabella.
If you rely on the newspapers to get accurate reporting on this, then you're barking up the wrong tree, because the newspapers frequently misrepresent and distort these cases, because certain sections of the press have a vested interest in us scrapping the Human Rights Act and pulling out of the European Convention, because the Article 8 right to private and family life holds them to account for some of their more lurid kiss and tell stories.
Well, that's true. But Isabella, important to say that we're not relying on press reports. We're relying on the dad of Amy here, Paul Houston, which is quite different.
And if I may, I have enormous sympathy with Mr. Houston. I've met him and I've talked to him about his case, and it's an incredibly tragic case, what happened to his daughter. But the Human Rights Act is not the piece of legislation or the thing to blame in his case. The actual reason why Mr. Ibrahim couldn't be deported is because the Home Office didn't act quick enough to seek his deportation after he was convicted in the way that he was. Again, it was another incident to the Home Office blunder. And the judge in the case actually said if the Home Office had sought his deportation at an earlier point, there would have been nothing here to keep him in the UK. But the fact was, by the time they sought his deportation, he had 2 children in the UK, and he'd taken over the adoption of 2 more. And what the court was interested in was the rights of his innocent children not to have their father sent away. Of course, there's difficult balancing judgments that have to be taken in these cases, but it was actually Home Office inefficiency which is to blame here. But of course, as we've seen many times,
let's let Paul back in here. The rights. Paul, do you want to come back in? The rights of Mr. Ibrahim's innocent children.
Let me tell you how the facts are, because I was at the tribunal. I was at every tribunal Mr. Ibrahim attended. There is some truth regarding. It's a bit of both. You have to understand. I mean, Isabella is right in the sense that the border agency is ineffective, and had they dealt with the case sooner, then and with a lot of cases it wouldn't get to the human rights stage. But I mean, I accept what you said. It's a right of Mr. Ibrahim's children, their human rights, but it still doesn't address the balance of where does it say that Mr. Ibrahim's children come before the rights of my child and my human rights. And the thing was, is in the actual court, it wasn't proved. Well, first of all, I'm not so sure about that he's actually adopted the 2 other children that Mr. Richardson has, because I don't see how he could be if he hasn't got legal status in the country.
Is this about, then, Isabella Sankey, is this about the Act itself, or is it about the interpretation of the Act by lawyers in this country and judges in this country?
Look, I think it's fair to say that not everybody is going to agree about how these principles and values are interpreted in each case. The point about this case I was making was that it's very easy for the Human Rights Act to be a scapegoat for blundering officials, and we see that all the time. And I think it's very important to make this distinction. But of course there are going to be disagreements. Of course the Act has to deal with. Of course judges applying the Act have to deal with very sensitive balancing of judgments. But the problem we have in this country at the moment is whenever there is a decision that certain people don't like or senior politicians feel annoyed about, instead of just expressing disquiet about that, people start talking about revisiting these fundamental values that we've believed in as a society for a long time. In the US, when there's a controversial decision under the US Bill of Rights, people don't talk about ripping it up and starting again. The convention was put into place by Winston Churchill following the horrors of the Second World War, and it was put there to protect every single man, woman, and child.
Okay, I'm going to ask you. I'm going to ask you in a moment. All stay there, please. I'm going to ask you in a moment or two, Isabella, after the travel news, to make the case to the British people for the European Court of Human Rights, to tell us what I suppose classically Monty Python style, what's the European Court of Human Rights ever done for us? So prepare that one, Isabella, and I know you'll do a good turn on it. Let's get quick comments. So very quick comments from everybody, and I'm going to rush through this if you'll let me. Michael in Worcestershire, a quick comment from you, sir. Good morning.
Good morning. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. A quick comment.
Well, I'm very strongly against the human rights because it was originally drawn up for lesser nations after the Second World War. I can remember Churchill saying it was for lesser nations. It was not for Britain. And we drew this stupid act up. Not stupid, no, because it had a rightful place at the time.
Okay, thank you, Michael. Peter in Durham, quick comment.
I think we should keep the Court of Human Rights. The human rights legislation protects minority groups, of which I happen to be one. And in this country, we have a Public Order Act, which has a Section 5 in it, which actually allows prejudice and allows prosecution for people with prejudice against others who have done absolutely nothing wrong. The only defence that we have under British law is the Court of Human Rights.
Thank you, Peter. Tony in Macclesfield, your quick comment.
I think we're perfectly competent to judge our own people under our own laws, and we have done for centuries. I see no need for an external body to override or act in judgment on what we can do.
Thank you. John in Dumbarton, finally, before the travel news. Hi, John.
Well, if you were a gay person before the year 2000, the British courts and the British Parliament were totally useless. They failed gay people. If it hadn't been for the European Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg, gay people would be getting chucked out of the armed forces today in 2012. And lots of pensioners now get the prescriptions at 60. Before it used to be 65 for men and 60 for women. That had to go all the way to Strasbourg. So a lot of your elderly callers are anti-European. You remember, they get their free prescriptions at 60 thanks to the European Court decision in Strasbourg.
Thank you very much indeed. Right, Isabella Sankey's going to make the case in a minute. I'm sure Roger Helmer won't particularly agree with. I think Paul's going to be still with us, arguing his case from the standpoint of the tragic death of Amy. It's 9:20. Here's me. It's 9:22. Right, Isabella Sankey. Are you ready? Director of Policy at Human Rights Group Liberty, you made a very interesting point earlier on. There is a distinct lobby in this country who are against it because they're worried about freedom of expression in the press being in some way restricted. So you argue that that gives a disproportionately negative view of the European Court of Human Rights. Balance it up for us. Go on.
Well, there's lots of things you don't read about in the headlines that the European Court has done to protect people in this country and, in fact, all over Europe for many, many decades. We wouldn't have the equal treatment provisions that we now have in our law for the protection of lesbian and gay people if it weren't for judgments from the European Court of Human Rights, which insists that you cannot be discriminated against on the grounds of your race, your sex, or your sexual orientation. Did you know, for example, as well, that if it weren't for the European Court of Human Rights, we wouldn't have phone hacking offences on the statute book, which means that everything that went on at News of the World and elsewhere wouldn't actually be illegal if it weren't the previous judgments that we got in the 1990s.
How do we know we wouldn't? How do we know that we wouldn't have made that illegal anyway and have altered our own laws accordingly, as we have done over the centuries?
Well, if you look at the way in which we've altered our laws over the last few decades, it's invariably only in response to European Court of Human Rights judgments when the government's hand has been forced that they've brought our laws into line with human rights standards. That's why it's so important that there's an independent check on government to protect each and every man, woman and child in this country. And the list goes on.
And the former Archbishop of Canterbury, before you talk about the irony, because the former Archbishop of Canterbury, Lord Carey, is one of a group of people, a certain hue of Christian who are hoping to take their case to the European Court of Human Rights to bolster their arguments that they should be able to display their religious symbols, aren't they?
Yes, and actually Liberty used to represent Nadia Awada, the woman who worked for British Airways that just wanted to wear a cross around her neck and was told that she couldn't. This is the point. It's not just minority groups or unpopular groups that the court protects and the convention protects. It's actually the only way in which any right to religious freedom can be defended in the courts, and that's why they're having to rely on Article 9 to go to the European Court to say that Christian people in this country should be allowed to manifest their faith in a reasonable way. So it protects everybody in all sorts of ways.
Even people we don't like.
Even people we don't like who deserve protection as well. And that is the marker, surely, of a civilised society.
Roger
we can't
Helmer.
talk up human rights in Burma
there's just so
and
much
denigrate them at
nonsense
home.
being talked. I mean, lots and lots of these things that come from Europe. People talk about Europe's given us clean beaches, as though we wouldn't have legislated for clean beaches by ourselves. Now, the point is that the European Court of Human Rights is preventing us from dealing with terrorists, leaving them on the streets, preventing us from sending them back home. It's preventing us from ejecting illegal immigrants who have committed serious crimes, and the public just can't understand that. And let's look at this issue of a right to a family life. Of course people have a right to a family life, but why do they have a right to a family life in Britain? If they are being ejected, they can take their family with them and they can have a family life in their own country. What right do they have to come here and commit crimes here and stay here and claim welfare here? You know, the public are angry about this and they want to see it changed, and I hope it will be changed.
Isabella?
Oh, sorry. I was
It's all right.
to come back at that one.
I thought it was quite vibrant stuff from Roger. I'm sure he didn't doze off.
Look, there's nothing in the convention that stops us from prosecuting people that we suspect of terrorism, and that's what's so bonkers about the situation we now find ourselves.
That's just a downright untruth. We're finding that this doesn't happen. That we can't put them away. We can't.
Of course, you can prosecute somebody who you suspect of terror offences. We've always been able to do that.
But frequently, in the case of terrorist offences, it isn't possible to use the evidence which is available to the authorities for reasons that you know perfectly well.
That's absolutely not true. Mr. Qatadas' place, there's evidence all over the place of him inciting people to do violent acts, and we could quite easily put him on trial. The problem is the previous government adopted this approach of all we need to do in these cases is deport people. What if he was a British national? What would we do with him then? I would hope we would prosecute him.
So you're saying that there should be no difference between British nationals and foreign criminals?
No, there is the possibility of deporting people. There always has been. The only bar
of deportation is if you think
that somebody is going to be tortured or they're going to face torture evidence in their trial. And if we are a civilised society, and if we believe in fundamental rights and freedoms, and if we want to stand in solidarity with people currently spilling blood on the streets of Syria, then we have to abide by these principles at home and not be hypocrites.
Well, to curtail our own human rights would be a terrible example, wouldn't it? There's Stephen in Surrey and Jimmy in Durham. Let's see what the public thinks. Stephen, a quick word.
Yes, it makes me sick when I hear Liberty whining on. We have people like Shami Chakrabarti, the director, coming on. We've got another woman on today. They talk about vested interests. What about the vested interests of these human rights lawyers milking the taxpayer? I'm sick of the Human Rights Act. You know, it's an absolute disgrace. We had the old Matrix change that we show you QC that got the Afghan hijackers off with human rights legislation. They make me want to vomit. They really do. The sooner we pull out of this damn convention, which initially was a good idea after the Holocaust, but it's now becoming a charter for terrorists and undesirables. And I'm disgusted when I heard Ken Clark this morning. Absolutely disgusted. And the sooner we're out of this human rights industry, the better.
What about the okay, let's Stephen in Surrey. Jimmy in Durham, come back to Stephen on that. You think the opposite?
Good morning. Well, I used to come from that angle. I didn't like what was going on, but on my case, it's only a simple thing, but overall it's a big thing in a way. I'm a self-employed heavy goods vehicle driver.
Yeah.
And the European Commission, who will behaving like Nazi Germany, have rammed a law through where I have to obey the working time directive. Now, that's only a small thing. And I got to think to myself, what else could come after that? So you need somebody to keep that lot keep them, you know, so that they can't run roughshod like they presently are doing.
So was that the European
Commissioning?
Was that the European Court of Human Rights? Was it? So yeah.
No, that wasn't them. But you would need them in future when the European Commission and people like Mr. Stephen Hughes and a Euro MP who ran things through against a lot of people's wills.
Well,
you need an outside body to stop them running roughshod.
Hang on a minute. And Stephen as well.
A very good thing.
Stephen as well. What about, and indeed your good self, Roger Helmer. Stephen in Surrey.
Yeah.
The UK DNA database on the 4th of December 2008, the European Court of Human Rights gave its judgment relating to that, stating that the retention of cellular samples, fingerprints and DNA profiles constitutes an infringement of the right for private life under Article 8.
We could have a British Bill of Rights. We could have a British Bill of Rights that protects our interests.
Why can't we have a British Bill of Rights, Isabella Sankey?
Do you know what the nonsense of the position that we should have a British Bill of Rights and that would give us more sovereignty is?
If there was a British Bill of Rights, it would put human rights lawyers like her out of business, wouldn't it?
Give her the right to talk.
Let me just explain to you. You would actually do the reverse of what you're trying to do.
Give her the right to give her the right.
Reverse of what you're trying to do. The point about the Human Rights Act is it actually allowed British judges for the first time to adjudicate on the European Convention, which means we're sending less cases to Strasbourg now and having less judgments from European judges. So if you're against European judges ruling on what this country does, then you should be in favour of the Human Rights Act. And if you scrap the Human Rights Act and had a British Bill of Rights, it would mean all those cases were going back off to Strasbourg again. So it would be a real
we wouldn't go to Strasbourg at all if we had a British Bill of Rights.
Own goal to scrap the Human Rights Act and replace it with
But we can't let that one go. That's absolute nonsense. The whole point of bringing it back to the UK is that nothing would then go to Strasbourg. So to say that a British Bill of Rights...
It was never the case that nothing was going to Strasbourg. I'm so sorry, but you really are misunderstanding the legislation. It was never the case that nothing would go, but the point is that more cases are now adjudicated on here and don't have to go all the way to
you're mixing up two entirely different things. You're mixing up the British implementation of the European Convention on the one hand with the idea of a British Bill of Rights on the other. If we had a British Bill of Rights, we would be saying we are using the British Bill of Rights in place of the previous European Convention of Human Rights,
and
that would be adjudicated in
the
British
Human Rights Act, which domestically incorporates the Convention. So people would argue, trust me, I'm a human rights lawyer, I know what the arguments would be. People would argue...
Well, trust me, I'm a politician, I know what the law would be.
Trust me, I'm a politician.
They would go off to Strasbourg and argue that the British Bill of Rights didn't properly protect their rights, but the European Convention did. At the moment, they can't do that.
But we would withdraw from the European Convention if we had a British Bill of Rights.
And what kind of message would that send to every despot and dictator around the world?
What would be the point of creating a British Bill of Rights if we were also subject separately to the jurisdiction of another court? You just have duplicated the system and made matters worse.
Well, those advocating a British Bill of Rights in government are not advocating pulling out of the convention. They think that they can maintain both positions, and there is a complete contradiction and an irony there.
Well, my position would be we don't need a British Bill of Rights. We can depend on British common law and a free press and democracy, and we don't need the European Convention. I think the European Convention, when it was introduced, was an excellent thing, but it's been overinterpreted for decades by activist judges who have entirely their own agenda, and it's not an agenda the British people share, and there is no democratic accountability to it.
Thank you.
And we should be out of it.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you. It's 9:32, and here is Simon. Thank you. 9:34. Paul, thank you for talking to us this morning.
You're welcome.
Paul Houston. Where do you take your campaign now, Justice for Amy?
Well, I'll just keep chipping away and making my viewpoint made, and because I believe I'm right. The thing is the way the general public feel, we're starting to feel alienated by the Human Rights Act. I mean, it's a hypocrisy, the Human Rights Act, where the Human Rights Act was set up to protect the people from the state, and that's a perfect example in Syria. But the way the general public now see it is, it's about protecting the rights of paedophiles and criminals and terrorists. Why should we concern ourselves too much about somebody that wants to kill us when we see the genuine people of Syria suffering? And I feel that the Brighton Declaration, I don't really think that really is the answer, because we were promised reform of the Human Rights Act, and what we're actually going to get is, looking at it, it's more about compliance of individual states, so it's more about the states towing the line, so it doesn't really address the original question of whether the European Court has too much power. And before we can sell the human rights to the rest of the world, we have to make the general public believe in it, and I don't think it's got the backing of the general public.
Thank you.
And you're welcome.
We're going to have to leave it there, Paul. We're way over time, but good to have you on the programme. It's 9:36. Should Britain pull out of the European Court of Human Rights? Let's talk to Martin Howe, who is a human rights lawyer. Hello, Martin.
Good morning.
Human rights lawyers were getting a pretty bum rap from a previous caller a few minutes ago. I don't know if you heard him say,
I didn't hear it, but human rights lawyers in a state agency, yes, we're in the same sometimes.
Also, we have Peter Bone, Conservative MP for Welling Borough.
Hello.
Who's been pressing for Abu Qatadas deportation. Good morning, Peter Bone.
Good morning.
And Mark's in Staffordshire. Mark, what would you like to say?
Well, Nicky, I think I'm going to sit between your MP and Liberty here, and bang really the pair together, in as much as what they need to understand is the European Court of Human Rights does do lots of great things. It doesn't just deal with gay rights, which people keep going on about, which I've got no issues with at all. It does lots of other good things. However, it does need reforming, it needs bringing up to date, and the only way that that's going to happen in a positive way is Liberty working alongside government, and other pressure groups should work together and find positive ways to make the European Court of Human Rights work. They also need to stop harking on about the rights of the particular case at the moment with regard to his children. For goodness sake, if there was care about his children, why has this taken 10 years to be resolved? Why hasn't the Court of Human Rights stopped and thought about the rights of those children involved in this case?
Yeah.
And just get things knuckled down and sorted out?
What about giving prisoners the vote? That other one.
I personally am against the idea of giving prisoners the vote. I think if you commit a crime and you go to prison, your rights should be reduced. And I think any sound, normal human being would think of that way as well. Lawyers, which I spend an awful lot of money with and I have a lot of respect for, with due respect, do earn an awful lot of money out of the whole process, where, if they were a loan company, they would be severely pulled in check.
Oh, there you go again. Let's bring him in. Let's bring him in again. Martin Howe, why have human rights lawyers? I mean, for goodness sake, the nastiest, most evil criminal who's done the most horrible thing still has human rights, doesn't he?
Absolutely, and you must always put yourself or your family in that position. If someone is coming at you unfairly, or if they're not taking into account your fundamental rights, would you want them protected? And would you go to a human rights lawyer for that protection? I mean, just to come back on your contribution there from the caller about human rights lawyers somehow being the Rolls-Royce rich lawyers of the law. Quite the opposite is true. I mean, legal aid is the legal aid is the sort of the payment system. If you can get it, it's being taken away by our present government.
So how does it need to change, the European Court of Human Rights? What's wrong with it?
It needs changes in its procedure and administration. And where you have a situation with a 150,000 backlog of cases and the delay that naturally comes with that, there's something very wrong with that. But let's remember that there are already steps in place to improve that. I mean, now we have manifestly inadmissible cases, that's the test, being looked at by single judges within the European Court. And the estimate is that by 2015, the backlog will be cleared. So I'm in favour of those types of administrative improvements. I am massively in favour of any encouragement that comes out of the convention currently in Brighton that will improve the domestic application of the European Convention on Human Rights across the 47 states.
What has been achieved through the European Court of Human Rights that would not and could not have been achieved through a purely British legal system?
Well, what we do have is a uniformity of approach across 800 million people, and there's massive benefit from that. Let's remember that human rights have a universality.
Well, they do, but the Russians, for example, are not very pleased about having lesbian and gay rights foisted on them.
There is the real rub in this. If we say we're pulling out of the European Convention, and remember, we were the founding fathers of it. I mean, with Churchill would be spinning in his grave if he thought we were pulling out of a convention and a court that he was very much behind setting up. So countries like Russia would look to countries like us and say, well, look, if they're not prepared to be supervised by this court, if they're not prepared to come under its jurisdiction, why should we? And similarly, regimes around the world, Assad's regime in Syria. If we try to hold them to account for breaches of human rights, but we turn around and say, but on the other hand, we're not going to be looked at. You can't look at us. Don't look into our affairs. What type of message does that give?
Okay, Peter Bone.
Well, I suppose I disagree with most of what's just been said.
That's why you're on.
Thank you. I think that sovereign countries such as the United Kingdom should make its own decisions, and our Supreme Court has said deport Mr. Qatada and he should go. And I think a court that has 150,000 cases backlog is a farce, and I can see no point in the court whatsoever. But in the case of this alleged terrorist, I just put him on the plane, send him home, and worry about the legal situation afterwards. Because if we don't do that, we'll be talking about this case in 5 years' time, because his lawyers will have found at every stage an additional way of appealing against the court decision.
I wonder what Matt in Swindon thinks. Hello, Matt.
Morning, Nick. The thing that's got my goat this morning is the lady from Liberty trying to draw comparisons between campaigning for a lady who works for an airline, wanting to wear a cross, and then campaigning on behalf of this chap who's tragically killed this young girl. As the father rightly pointed out, where's his right to a family life? I just find the whole thing completely bizarre. and really do think that we as a country need to address our role within the European issue of human rights.
Thank you very much
indeed.
indeed.
It's about time we pulled out of it. And,
Okay. But what sort of message would that send if we pulled out of this? What message would it send to the rest of the world, Martin Howe? Those countries that we're trying to encourage to, put human rights on their statutes.
Yeah, it has to be a negative message. If we say that we're not going to be accountable, we're not going to be held up to account by a higher court. And I think back to the words of Thomas Fuller, who wrote back in 1733, "Be thou ever so high, the law is above you." If we challenge the rule of law, the message to other countries is, well, if they're not going to bother abiding by it, why should we?
That's the danger, Peter Bone, isn't it? Peter Bone.
Well, no, I just take this this idea that somehow you know better than another countries is to be pretty unimpressive. A sovereign country should make its own laws, make its own courts interpret them. I don't see why we should have a European super court. I just don't think that sovereign nations should be put in that position. And I just think the idea that Churchill will be spinning in his grave, well, that might be true, but he would be spinning his grave because the convention has been turned completely round. It was there to protect people against fascists. It's now being used to protect alleged terrorists.
And that point, Tony in Wakefield makes that point, I think, just before the travel news. I think he's echoing what you were about to say, as I understand it, Tony.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, the European Convention on Human Rights was drafted largely in just after the war in the late 40s, and it was a completely different world. And, there's no way that the original draftsman believed that Abu Qatada would be walking around the streets of London and we couldn't deport him, because the fact is, in 1947, he would have been hanging on the end of a rope long ago.
The debate seems to be hanging on what would be making Winston Churchill spin in his grave.
Yeah. I'm saying it's a completely different world, Nicky. I mean,
it is.
The way they thought at that time, Abu Qatada couldn't really have done what happened. Really, it couldn't have happened.
Thank you very much indeed. It's 9:49. Here's Michelle.
Your call.
Hello, Frank in Taunton. Good morning. On you go.
Good morning, Nicky. Yeah, I'd just like to make a brief point about the relevance of Article 8, right to private and family life. The conversations and discussions centred around terrorists, etc., which has very little relevance, thankfully, to most individuals listening to your programme. But as one of millions of fathers who've gone to the courts to seek access and gain access to their children, I was told repeatedly, 33 dates in court, that Article 8, the right to private and family life, meant absolutely nothing to me. And there'll be people turning up in court today that that's relevant to. So whilst it's a fantastic talk show, the relevance of Article 8 to the common man and woman in the street is limited. And I think that's of great relevance.
It is, and let's put that to Dominic Raab, who joins us, Conservative MP, member of the Joint Parliamentary Committee on Human Rights, a sceptic, I think we can fairly say, about the European Court for Human Rights. Did you hear that point there by Frank?
I did.
Yeah, what do you make of it?
Good point, well made.
The application of these, it seems some people see this as selective application. Dominic
Well, I thought there's a number of myths running around. The first is that this is Churchill's convention, and the NGOs love to criticise the tabloid media, but the fact is they deploy so much spin of their own. This convention was signed up to by the Attlee government in the late 40s, but even then we didn't sign up to the jurisdiction of the Strasbourg court till 1966 under Harold Wilson. What any of this has got to do with Churchill is beyond me, although he certainly did favour more European integration for continental Europeans. In terms of the selectivity, your previous human rights lawyer, I think Martin Howe, said that we've got to be in favour of uniform approaches to human rights across Europe. And yet, if you're Michael Turner or Andrew Semeo, extradited, innocent until proven guilty, but nonetheless extradited to appalling prison conditions, people that are innocent, you look at that, and then you look at someone like Qatada and Hamza running our justice system, running rings around our justice system, and you say, actually, far from being uniform, there are double standards.
Hamza's being extradited.
Say again?
Hamza is being extradited.
Yeah, after years and years, and Qatada hasn't been. The point I'm making is that if you're subject to a European arrest warrant, your feet don't touch the ground. Whereas actually you can, and in the case of Qatada, at the moment we're still battling against this Strasbourg ruling. The point I'm making is that there is double standards here.
OK, Martin Howe, double standards.
I mean, it's difficult to comment on specific cases without having access to all the facts, and I think your listeners should be aware of that. What there is a well-established jurisprudence in Europe that is applied consistently and uniformly across the 47 states, the 800 million people that are in it. And it's that type of universality of the application of fundamental rights that's at the heart of this.
This is a myth.
When we start tinkering with it, as Dominic Raab was suggesting, when we start pulling ourselves out of it, then we do create confusion
Gentlemen.
Wrong decision.
Gentlemen, we have the latest developments. I'll get you both to comment on this. The government says that the European Court of Human Rights should dismiss Abu Qatadas' appeal against deportation to Jordan because he has missed the deadline. We know about that. Let's get the very latest from our legal correspondent, Clive Coleman. Clive, what is the new information that you have?
Yeah, well, I've just spoken to a senior human rights lawyer who has a wealth of experience at the European Court of Human Rights on the crucial point of when time begins to run on this time limit. And it's a real lawyer's point, but a pretty clear one in his view, that if you look at Article 43, what it says is within a period of 3 months from, and from is the critical word, the date of the judgment of the Chamber. Now, the Chamber judgment was the first judgment in the Abu Qatada case, given on the 17th of January of this year. 3 months from that date expires at midnight on the 17th of April. So that would mean that on that wording, on that interpretation, the government got it wrong. Now, in support of that, he says that there's another time limit. It's not the same time limit, but the time limit for bringing cases, applications to the European Court of Human Rights also has a 6-month time limit. And that the same principles, he thinks, apply. And again, the wording of that article says within a period of 6 months from the date on which the final decision was taken. That's, in that instance, would be the final decision of a domestic court. So in both cases, the time limit is worded in terms of from the date of the last judgment. And in relation to that, there was a case called Otto versus Germany, where the European Court of Human Rights ruled that time runs on that 6-month time limit from the day after the date of the final domestic decision. Now, that would take it even later.
So is Theresa May up the creek without a paddle?
Well, on that analysis, the government has got it wrong.
Right. Dominic Raab.
Well, frankly, I don't know what the point is here. You found an anonymous human rights lawyer to disagree with the government's legal advice. The thing to note about this is that the government...
Well, Clive was making a point. It seems, Clive, you're saying it's pretty clear, is it?
Well, it's not just... Well, it's an anonymous human rights lawyer. It's a human rights lawyer who's looking at the wording that sets down when these applications have to...
No, sure, but that's exactly what the Home Secretary said that she and countless lawyers have done, and then called up the European Court of Human Rights and said, have we got this right? And then
and they said
proceeded, and they were reassured they did. I personally think this appeal will be dismissed, but I think there's a bigger question about what happens when the revived deportation process goes through the UK courts, and as I expect, it is given a green light, and then we'll have a political choice to make. But I don't, it would be inconceivable to my mind that the Home Office, which does so many of these cases, would have made a mistake.
If she's got it wrong,
regard.
Where does that leave her? If she has got it wrong.
Look, I'm not going to speculate on ifs and buts, but I'm pretty confident, and I think she seems very confident that they've got this right, and, the Home Office lawyers are pretty well versed in all of this.
Martin Howe.
You're wrong.
Sorry?
The idea that it's inconceivable that government makes wrong decisions is inconceivable in itself. And I think we should be looking at substance, not form here. Are we really saying that this man's rights about an issue as important as torture should all turn on a 22-hour...
It's not about him being tortured, is it?
No, exactly.
It's not about him being tortured.
It's not a torture case really at all.
It is really here, because the judgment that has, or the part of the judgment that has been appealed by his lawyers, was the finding made on the 17th of January of this year that he would not face torture when he went back. The reason that he wasn't to be deported according to the European Court was because the evidence that would be placed against him, that was obtained by use of torture.
Allegedly.
So they're appealing the point that there is no what's called an Article 3 risk. There is no risk of him being tortured on return.
But we've had assurances for the Jordanian government. Who are we to lecture to other governments?
Well, I mean, do we believe in a rule of law or not?
Well, human rights lawyers very often are the first people who say we should.
Can I just make a very simple point? The issue about whether Qatada will be tortured if he was sent back to Jordan had 3 appeals in this country and then went to Strasbourg. Everyone has said no. The issue is whether we can guarantee, Britain can guarantee, he'd have a fair trial. We talk about the rule of law a lot. I think, frankly, Strasbourg is making a mockery of the rule of law and British justice by turning human rights into a dirty word, because we're allowing someone like this, who's accused of serious terrorist offences, has a long history of involvement in terrorism, run rings around our justice system. No one is suggesting he shouldn't have due process, but he's had 4 appeals already, including one at Strasbourg. How many more until the human rights lawyer says, actually, do you know what, he did have due process?
Well, he has as many as he is allowed under due process.
And that's the point. We think that he's had 3 UK appeals, he's now been to Strasbourg, had the case properly heard.
But you know what?
And he wants to appeal again.
A final thought, Dominic Raab.
Yeah.
Abu Qatada is the sort of person who doesn't want anyone to have any of these rights. Isn't it rather wonderful that we're fighting that he can have the rights that he doesn't want any of us to have? Isn't that just a great thing? Doesn't that just put us on that high pedestal?
Nicky, I'll leave you on cloud 9. I think most people think it's a lack of common sense.
Thank you, Dominic Raab.
Cheers.
Thank you very much indeed to Clive Coleman there for that interesting conversation that he recently had with an anonymous human rights lawyer. Far from an anonymous one, Martin Howe. Thank you.
BBC Radio 5 Live.
Your call now. Should Britain pull out of the European Court of Human Rights? Carry-on Qatada, Europe's court jesters. Many headlines this morning focus on Abu Qatada. Do we need this court? We're a civilised country, good human rights record. Would we be any worse off without it? There are those who say we should part ways with it. It's just holding us back, coming up with some outrageous decisions. But it's good to be at the forefront of this in the world, to show a good example to the rest of the world. Is one of our finest achievements. Protecting the millions of people, the human beings who these rights are for, safeguarding their rights, our rights, is having to keep people like Abu Qatada a price worth paying for the greater good. Justice Secretary Ken Clarke says you can't judge its success on a few high-profile failures.
A minister like myself can't keep up a running commentary on every decision of every court, reacting to newspaper descriptions of the facts or the reaction of aggrieved relatives or victims or whoever. This dotting about from case to case where it happens to have annoyed or upset somebody is no way of judging legal process.
Is he right? Should we look at the big picture and be thankful for it? Should we pull out of the European Court of Human Rights? That's the question. 0500 909 693, that's the number, and here's the text, 85058.
Made remorseful for what he'd done. If he'd stayed with the car with Amy, then it could have made all the difference.
But he left the scene, yeah.
But he ran off and left her trapped under the wheels of the car, and she died. She died 4 hours later. I had the difficult decision, well, the awful decision of any parent would have to go through, which is having to switch a life support machine off. But, excuse me, but it was the fact that he got in a car and drove it a year later, and he had a string of other convictions for possession of drugs and damage to property and harassment, burglary, and he'd also been, the family man that he claimed to be, he was also arrested for a domestic incident and bound over to keep the peace, you know. So, you know, it's very galling when somebody claims to be a family man, and in reality, you know, the fact is quite different. And it's the way that the tribunals are set up where they accept hearsay evidence.
We'll get on to that. Can I play you this interview? You possibly didn't hear it because I mentioned your case because I met you the other day at the Big Questions, and it was a great meeting you.
Thank you.
And talking to you at length about this on the air and off the air. And so because of that, fresh in my mind,
was my viewpoint took into consideration in the tribunal.
What did the judge say to you at the tribunal?
Well, the UK Border Agency actually, the barrister for the UK Border Agency actually said, when I asked him what about my rights, he said, well, quite frankly, Mr. Houston, you haven't got any. However, you know, when it went to the High Court, the Royal Court of Justice, the High Court judge there did say, even though he wasn't actually ruling on the original decision, he said had this case come before him, he possibly would have took a different viewpoint, which makes me sort of feel that I was sort of right in what I was saying, but the decision had already been made, so they didn't really want to be seen to be looking stupid and overruling another judge.
And how do you feel about the fact Mr. Ibrahim has been allowed to stay here after everything that has happened? And he drove away from the scene and he didn't have insurance, he didn't have a licence, did he? How do you feel about the fact that he was granted leave to stay here because of his right to a family life, given that you lost Amy?
Well, it was very galling, and you know, I mean, I'm not an unreasonable man. You know, had he just come into the country and he wasn't aware of the driving regulations, and he got in a car and drove it, and it had been an accident, and he was genuinely...
Good morning. Right, the European Court of Human Rights, there's a big conference about it in Brighton, seeing if it can be sorted out in the sense that there is such a backlog of cases. Can they get them through the system quicker? So people who very much support the European Court of Human Rights worry that that will sideline justice for some people. It's 6 minutes past 9 o'clock. Spoke earlier on to Ken Clarke, the Secretary of State for Justice, on this. Mentioned Paul Houston. Good morning, Paul.
Good morning, Nicky.
Good to talk to you. Now, I mentioned to him that I had spoken to you about this. Just to tell people, just joining us, yours is one of the cases that people always cite as an egregious example of it not working and a perverse decision. Amy, right, your daughter, 12 years old, knocked down and killed by a failed Iraqi asylum seeker, Mr. Ibrahim. The courts tried to deport him. He was allowed to stay after arguing it would breach his human rights. Specifically, this was Article 8, wasn't it?
That's right, yes.
Would you tell us about your campaign.
Well, my campaign is about making the Human Rights Act sort of balanced and fair for the individual. My argument's always been the court doesn't take into consideration my human rights over Mr. Ibrahim's, and no point.
I mentioned this as an example to Ken Clarke. I had an exchange with the Justice Secretary earlier on. You can probably hear it now for the first time. Here's some of what happened here. 12-year-old Amy Houston, she was run over by an Iraqi failed asylum seeker who was in Britain. He fled the scene. She died in hospital. And this is key, and you will be able to comment on this. He was sentenced... No, you will be able to comment on this, because I'm going to ask you...
You're relying on newspaper accounts.
I'm not. I spoke to her father the other day. I spoke to her father the other day.
But you're still relying on newspaper accounts.
I'm relying on her father.
Yeah, the European Court of Human Rights also said that the holding of DNA from people who've not been charged... Of course it is.
Can I ask you about Article 8?
We only lose 1 in 1,000.
Can I ask you about Article 8?
1 in 100.
This Iraqi asylum seeker was...
Can we deal with what we're doing?
Can I ask you about Article 8? Yes. Can I ask you about Article 8? Yes.
Article 8 of what?
The right to a family life. This Iraqi asylum seeker was allowed to stay in this country, and he was a failed asylum seeker because of Article 8, because he had a right to a family life. What Paul, Amy's father, says is, what about his right to a family life? Now he's lost his only daughter.
Well, it sounds like a tragic case, but really it is completely silly to reduce such a tragedy